My name is Ed Rothberg. I'm the CEO at Garebi Optimization. One major new feature in our new release is a new bilinear mixed-integer programming solver. This allows us to handle problems with non-convex quadratic objectives and non-convex quadratic constraints. Non-convex quadratic constraints arise in a number of different problems. One important example is pooling problems, which are quite common in continuous manufacturing.
Hello, and thanks for that introduction, and thanks for the invitation. I'm coming from my home office in Evanston, Illinois. It's really great to be with you today. What a strange time it is. The COVID crisis has somehow touched every one of us in so many ways. It's disrupted our work, our life at home, the way we socialize, the way we teach our children, how we exercise and stay healthy, how we eat. I've read more books in the last 8 weeks than I have in the entire prior year, and I consider myself to be a pretty avid reader. I've taken on a couple of really challenging knitting projects, and I float between that and working on a 1,000-piece puzzle. I've even gotten my sewing machine out, and I am making masks. And I have to say, if any of you have access to elastic, please get in touch with me. My sewing machine is so old and so stiff at this point, it only goes in one direction. I really need to get it fixed. I've gotten my husband to do all the grocery shopping as well as the vacuuming. So there's actually some good things that have come out of this quarantine. I've also connected with a lot of friends, and I've heard that comment from other folks too that I've talked to, that these are people that I haven't talked to in years, and we've reached out and we've had Zoom calls, and it's been really quite wonderful. But no doubt, this crisis has also hit many of us with deep personal losses. And I have to say that I have not been spared that pain. I'm also certainly sorry if you've shared that kind of loss. But today, I am here to talk to you about the impact the crisis has had on the analytics community. And I'm going to come at you with a lot of data, which is exactly what I'm thinking you expected me to. There's a lot of bad in these numbers, but there's also some good. So let's get started. Just a bit about me and Burtch Works to start. We celebrated our 10th anniversary this last year as the premier executive recruiting firm that specializes in placing people in the quantitative business sciences. I've been recruiting analytics professionals now for over 30 years, and I don't get into details beyond 30 years at this point. My educational background is actually in industrial engineering, and I studied some operations research. I started on the corporate side with Whirlpool and with Pepsi, and then I got into recruiting, starting with a focus in operations research recruiting. And I got to tell you, I loved it from the very first day. And I still love what I do. And it's 30 plus years later. And so why do I love it? It's because I have had the privilege to connect with hundreds and hundreds of really smart people. And I learned a lot from them, and I've had an opportunity to grow with them. So I just wanted to take a second and thank you. So I'm going to start with some data at the national level. To set the stage, but before I get into the data about the analytics communities specifically. This graph, of course, shows the unemployment rate. This last report from a week ago shows the rate approaching 15%, and that's the highest rate that's ever been recorded. The previous high was 10.8%, and that was back in 1982. Now, the Great Depression occurred before these numbers were tracked, But economists have estimated that the unemployment rate about along those times could have been at 25%. More recent predictions from the White House have said the unemployment rate is going to end up going over 20%. Another interesting number I watch is the number of claims for unemployment, which is a number that comes out every Thursday. Now, this number has stayed pretty steady at about 225,000 claims per week, and that's been happening for over a year now, so many months, until the COVID crisis. The most recent number for May 7th was for 3.2 million new claims. And the 7-week total has been for 33.5 million claims. Now, the rate is going down week by week, but it's still quite an eye-popping number. You also have to keep in mind that these numbers are likely lower than the reality. It doesn't take into account all of the people that have been furloughed by many companies, nor can it count the many people who have not been able to access benefits due to the overload on the government systems. Here are some more really ugly numbers. 50% of U.S. companies are considering layoffs at this point, and that's according to Challenger, Gray, and Christmas, which is an outplacement and advisory firm. And a total of 47 million jobs will be lost during this crisis. And that's an estimate from the Federal Reserve of St. Louis. Now, here's a partial list of companies that have gone through layoffs up to this point. The list is actually much longer, but I didn't want to have to use too small of a font for you. So if you take a closer look at the names, what you'll see is that the immediate impact of the shutdown happened to the hospitality industry. So Marriott and MGM Resorts showed up right away in the early weeks. Then in the 3rd week through 6th week, the retailers started to reduce headcount. So Macy's, Nordstrom, Best Buy, and very sadly, Kohl's. And I say very sadly Kohl's because my newly graduated son, who recently graduated with an industrial engineering degree from Purdue, just started at Kohl's in logistics in February. But he's been very lucky. They need him to move product from the distribution centers from the stores. And now that the stores are starting to open, they need to get the product from the distribution centers back into the stores. So he's had a very interesting first couple of months. Now, more recently, startups have joined the ranks of layoffs like Uber, Airbnb, Spot Hero, which is a local firm in Chicago, Groupon, and WeWorks. All are reducing staff, and in some cases, quite drastically. And some of the larger industrial companies like GE and Baker Hughes and Boeing, as examples, are starting to lay off now also. More recently, in the last week, I've been hearing about consulting firms laying off, but these are the consulting organizations that primarily rely on an offshoring model. Organizations like Mu Sigma and Genpact as examples. So you can definitely see clusters and patterns in the companies that are going through layoffs at this point. But there's also a number of industries that have been on what I would call the winning side of this crisis. The pharmaceutical companies, the insurance companies, many consumer packaged goods, as well as banks. Big tech is another group of companies that's doing very well, as is video gaming companies. We still have EA as one of our hiring clients, lucky for us. Surprisingly, many advertising agencies have not laid off, at least not in substantial numbers. And the big consulting firms are holding on to pretty much all of their people at this point. Airlines also, at least here in the United States, are not laying off yet, but that's largely due to the government assistance that they've taken, which requires them to retain their people through the end of September. Some of them, like United as an example, have already announced significant cutbacks that are expected to start in October. So now let's take a specific look at the analytics community. Is anybody out there operating business as usual? Working from home, that's the new normal for sure. Many of you are probably familiar with our flash surveys. We reach out to our contacts periodically and ask just one question. Sometimes we sneak in the second question. And we get a great response because of that. And the response comes back really quickly. And we can pretty much slice and dice it for a lot of demographic information because we already know where everybody is working and their educational background and how much experience they have and where they live, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So in this particular flash survey that I conducted last week, we asked if there was anybody out there not working from home. So in this particular case, I didn't have to do any slicing and dicing because, as you can see, we got 346 responses in less than 24 hours. Only one person goes into the office, and a second person said they go in a few times a week. So that's less than 0.5%. We've also been watching job board listings. This slide shows the number of listings on LinkedIn's job board over the last several weeks. We looked at the jobs titled Data Scientist and Data Engineer. You can see the dip in the beginning, at least, was pretty substantial, but the good news is that there are still thousands and thousands of listings. Now, I will caution you, though, not to read too much into those thousands. Many firms have annual contracts with LinkedIn where they buy or they commit to dozens and dozens of continuous job slots. So they don't want them to go to waste, but most firms are actually in a hiring freeze or a hiring holding pattern right now. So these listings of jobs that they have on the board is simply to collect resumes with the hope that in the not too distant future, they'll be able to resume their hiring. The other thing that I wanted to point out here is that the major drop occurred pretty early. And relatively speaking, things have kind of leveled out since then over the last month or so. We also wanted to find out how the crisis has impacted the graduating class of 2020. We heard back from 19 schools with analytics programs, and we found that nearly every program had students that were impacted. 26% had companies push back start dates. 79% of the programs reported that they were experiencing companies putting their hiring on hold, and 37% of the schools reported having students that had offers unfortunately rescinded. 10% actually reported that they had had no impact, but one of those schools quickly added, at least not yet. When I decided to collect data on the entry hiring market, I was thinking that the headline on this particular slide might be, "My mom always told me to be a data scientist," but instead I had to title it, "Not even data scientists are safe." Now, I wanted to give you more of a deep dive look into what's happening at the entry market. So I turned to my buddy, Michael Rappa, over at North Carolina State University. He's the founding director of the Institute for Advanced Analytics and a good night director at the university. He launched the Masters in Analytics program in 2006. So it's been going for 14 years now. And it was the very first program of its kind. Now there are close to 300 different Masters in Analytics programs out there. Now, Michael has tracked metrics on his students since the beginning and shared a lot with me on this year's class. And you can see here that there's been some impact to his graduating class, but for the most part, the students are coming out just fine. This year, Michael had 116 students, which was a slight rise over last year. This year's placement rate is 79%, compared to rates that normally range between 90 and 95%. So there's somewhat of a dip. Additionally, Michael shared with me that one employer delayed start dates by 3 months. 2 employers rescinded job offers, although he quickly added that both of those students were able to secure other offers. And 3 employers intended to extend offers, but their companies went on a hiring freeze before they could do so. Also, the average offers per student dipped this year. Last year it was 2.5 offers per student, and this year it's 2.1. But still, that's not that bad. Now I want to discuss the findings from the Pulse survey that we've been conducting over the last several weeks. In this case, Burtch Works teamed up with IIA, the International Institute of Analytics. IIA is an advisory and assessment organization that works closely with many, many companies as they go down their path to analytics maturity. We put together a brief survey to get a sense of how organizations were being impacted and what actions they were taking to respond to the COVID crisis. So far, we've conducted 4 waves. Specifically, we were looking to capture snapshots during this very rapidly evolving event. Just a bit about our methodology. Burtch Works and IIA sent the survey to a number of our contacts, and we also leveraged our social media. So these results reflect their answers. Now, what we were going for in this case was speed and a wide response. And in fact, we heard from over 250 respondents who actually agreed to then participate in our survey over time. First, let's take a look at how the crisis has impacted the analytics group's workload. This slide illustrates responses ranging from business as usual all the way to drop everything and focus on the COVID crisis. You can see that there's now less panic in recent weeks. As of the last week in April, only a bit over 3% of companies were solely focused on COVID analytics. But this slide also shows that the number of analytics groups operating business as usual continuously has dropped and is now at 21.4%. This slide examines how organizations are using analytics to address the crisis. Over 40% of the respondents in the latest survey said that the analytics is now front and center with the decision making around COVID. In this round, about half said that analytics were used by some in the organization, but that some in the organization are not using analytics. And you can see that in the early weeks of the crisis, many times decisions could not wait for analytics impact, likely because things were just moving way too quickly. but that number seems to have settled down. You know, I did hear from one person that attitudinal data has become more important again, which I'm sure many of you will be happy to hear. There's just not enough data right now available yet for reliable behavioral analytics. One commenter mentioned that their work has shifted from what was pretty straightforward response and operations issues around COVID to focus on what's ahead, which of course is a much more complex problem. Now let's take a look at the impact the crisis has had on staffing and hiring. You can see that the impact to headcount has increased pretty dramatically over these 4 weeks. It started in mid-March at about 20% of firms experiencing freezes or salary cuts or layoffs, and now it's over 40%, just a little over 4 weeks later. Now this sort of matches up with the slide that I showed in the beginning, listing the companies that have gone through layoffs. But it'll be really interesting to see what happens to these numbers over the next several weeks. Will they stabilize, or will the number of organizations experiencing furloughs or layoffs continue to grow over time? I also wanted to show you how workforce action differed among different sizes of and or maturity of an organization. Now this slide shows the impact the crisis has had on younger firms, with over 2/3 having some level of headcount reduction, so they were pretty hard hit. Whereas the larger firms, more than half had not had any action taken, even after 2 months passing in this crisis. I'm going to also be quite interested in watching that number in upcoming weeks, because I suspect the headcount, the impact to headcount at larger firms has not really yet hit for a number of reasons. The first one being, it could be that the company is selling disinfectant wipes maybe, or is somehow some other way on the right side of this crisis. Secondly, I'm wondering whether or not companies are in more of a wait and see mode, and they can afford to do that. So they really don't want to reduce headcount of analytics professionals in particular, just to turn around in a couple of months and have to go through the pain of recruiting again. Or lastly, it could be that these companies are more what I call downstream from the immediate impact of the crisis. So unlike retail and hospitality, which were right on the front line, let's say they might be maybe in banking, where their loans are eventually going to be at risk, but it hasn't hit yet, or big consulting, where maybe they still have active projects, but the pipeline's starting to look a little bit thin. Now, this round, this last survey from last week, we asked the respondents who indicated that their analytics teams had seen some sort of impact to their headcount. We asked them for more detail. So of the firms that had taken some staffing action, we found that 74% had reduced salaries of their analytics employees, which is a big number. Now, that's certainly not welcomed, but it's certainly better also than losing your job entirely. Also, furloughs have become used very frequently, and that is not something that I've ever seen in prior recessions. I suspect that that's probably because businesses are betting that this is a V-shaped recovery, and that within a few months, we're going to see a pretty rapid rebound. At least I think that's what they're hoping for. Just to add a bit more information about this, we're also hearing that promotions have been put on hold and raises have also been put on hold. Some have been pushed out until later this year, some no response on. But who knows what this economic recovery will look like. I will tell you, though, it's not going to look like this slide for sure. Maybe it'll be a V shape with a quick recovery, or maybe it'll be shaped more like a U with a longer trough. Some say it might be more like a W if we have a resurgence in the fall. And maybe it might be like the Wall Street Journal was reporting, more like a Nike swoosh. I'm rooting for a V-shaped recovery. Now, this sort of shock is really tough on businesses, in particular smaller businesses, and I can say that Burtch Works has certainly not been spared. I do think there are things about the future of this pandemic that we do know. First, there will be more layoffs, and unfortunately, they're certainly going to hit some of the analytics teams. As I spoke about earlier, some of the downstream companies will take action probably in the next couple of months or so if this continues. Maybe there'll be a rapid reversal, but all indications are probably not. These firms are like the big banks and more even well-established startups and the big consulting firms, and certainly the airlines. I was actually surprised that more of the startups are just now starting to lay off, like Uber, Airbnb, WeWorks. I'm surprised that they really didn't jump more toward acting, going forward with a layoff. The global supply chain will forever be changed. The significant risks associated with a pandemic or an active war just has not been given enough weight. Well, now they certainly will be. This bodes well for the job security of operations research people in supply chain. This is not exactly related, but a consultant shared with me that he has seen consumer packaged goods companies as well as retailers pull back in their marketing and advertising spend, kind of with the fear of overstressing their supply chains. So there may be many facets of the supply chain that's going to need a re-examination. Business is just not going to go from lights on to lights off to lights back on again. It's going to be much slower than that, and we are walking baby steps right now in the business community. Most analytics teams are going to be working from home. I'm hearing many organizations September, some October, with no company travel till at least 2021. So a lot of questions remain. What's the trajectory of the recovery going to look like? How long will we all be working from home? Or maybe I should be asking if any of us will ever routinely go back to the office. Will there be a resurgence of the virus in the fall, and will we have to shut down again? And specifically around the analytics community, there's a lot of questions. I wonder about compensation. Is this going to impact salaries? As many of you know, Burtch Works puts out a salary study every year. We've been doing this for many, many years. And our data collection period just ended at the end of April. And we're going to be coming out with a report in June. It's not likely we're going to see any impact to this year's numbers, but I'll be very interested to see what 2021 numbers look like. Anecdotally, the candidates that are coming on the market right now because they're laid off or furloughed are indicating that they can be pretty flexible on compensation given the economic situation. But the good news is I really haven't seen the companies that are still hiring taking advantage of the situation. We're only 2 months into this downturn, so let's see what the landscape looks like when the fall gets here. Another thought is, will this possibly result in a race to grab analytics talent while it's available? Astute hiring managers might see this as a great opportunity to fill those roles that have been open for a long period of time. I had a lengthy conversation just this last week with a senior retail executive who was telling me about his frustrations around hiring a data science leader over this last year. His organization right now is in a holding pattern, but he's going to push for an exception so that he can pick up talent that might not ordinarily be available. Another example is that we've gotten a couple of calls from private equity groups in the last 10 days or so. And both are looking to staff up their portfolio companies with analytics talent. Now, people in private equity are usually pretty savvy when it comes to things like market timing. So I'm wondering, I don't think it's a coincidence that they're deciding to move forward now to pick up analytics talent. Well, one thing is for certain, this is not the end, although we're getting to the end of my talk, which is good. I heard and read over and over again that the COVID crisis will do nothing but boost the visibility of the analytics team. And in fact, I suspect that the analytics team, even in the hardest hit industries, are pretty much loath to reduce their headcount of their groups. After all, if you're one of those hiring managers out there, you know it's one of the toughest talents to hire, recruit, and train. So clearly the need for analytics to navigate business through this time of crisis is absolutely critical. Data-driven decision-making is truly an anecdote to this sort of emotionally run time. Companies that were creeping toward digital transformation are now sprinting toward that conversion. So let me conclude by saying what I always say: there's never been a better time to be in analytics. Thank you very much. That is it for me, and I think we're going to go on to some questions next.